We are live.
Appropriations, April 15th. We are still talking about the FY26 budget, but in context of cannabis revenue. So let's introduce yourself for the record, and you do have a handout, right?
Yes.
Or something on our website.
Sure. Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. There is, what is on the website is we developed a cannabis revenue tracker, and every month it updates how much excise and sales tax cannabis revenue has been generated and compares it kind of year to date and also month to month and compares it against the previous year. So I'm first going to share my screen and walk through that a bit just to give you a picture of how our new, relatively new adult use market is doing. And so through March, cumulatively, there is $15.1 million in cannabis excise tax revenue compared to $12.7 million from the previous fiscal year, an increase of 19%.
So can you point those out?
Yes, my cursor, if it's on the screen, is right here. So we're looking at the top right.
Okay, March 24, March 25.
Yep.
Okay.
And with the sales tax in March 25 cumulatively is $6.2 million against almost $5.3 million from last year. Similar rate of increase. So between the two tax types, you're looking at almost $21.4 million through March of 25. So we're 75% of the way through the fiscal year, and that's how revenues are doing.
Sorry. I should hold my questions.
Okay, absolutely. And then I would note that it seems like, now that I may have, but it seems like there is a bit of a plateau in cannabis revenues. So if we're looking at the next two boxes under here, the prior year monthly actuals and the fiscal year monthly actuals, you can see that whereas in the prior year started out at $1.2 million of excise tax roughly, and then increased to $1.7 million of cannabis excise tax roughly. Starting in fiscal year 25, started off with that similar $1.7 million, but in February and March, it was more than $1.5 million of excise tax revenue. And so this looks like we might start to see the market starting to plateau off, and could expect the market to kind of continue at a similar rate.
Can I ask the relationship between these numbers in the list and the graph?
So the graph is just showing the cumulative numbers. So the two boxes that are above them, those are the monthly numbers.
Yeah.
And underneath is showing the cumulative trends. And so the blues are your excise tax, your...
but it seems like the graph is also monthly numbers.
But it's adding them cumulative. So 1.7 in July, and then another 1.7 in excise tax revenues in August, and so those are adding it together. And so the bars are your current year, and the line is your prior year. And yes, it's the same. It's just reflecting the total that we've collected fiscal year to date, whereas these are just showing each month how much we're collecting. It's not adding it up cumulatively in the same way.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's not that in March 15 million came in. That's the total.
That's the total. Okay, exactly.
Since July.
I don't know why we would do that, but anyway.
Yeah, it makes it look you're like pretty good more and more.
Yeah.
Every month.
Okay.
Yes. No. So the difference between each of those months in this fiscal year plateaued somewhere between $1.5 million and $1.7 million. Good. And yes, also in March was the first time in the history of the adult use market where compared to the same month in the year prior, there was actually a year-over-year decrease. And since when you see in March rate is really reflecting excise tax revenues collected for the prior month, February was there's plenty of snow around. There's no reason to believe that the tourism market kind of fell flat for that month. It might be a blip, but it is interesting that this is the first time we've seen it year over year.
Can I clarify? So I'm down at the bottom of the page. 100% of the sales tax goes into the after-school fund.
Mm-hmm.
And then the excise tax, 100% goes in the general fund, but then 30% is transferred to substance misuse program from there.
So in fiscal year, it's different between fiscal year 25 and 26.
Yeah.
So in fiscal year 25, all that money is going into the regulation fund. And then the cannabis regulation fund. So that's in your first, kind of that first FY 24 and 25.
Okay. Yeah.
Excise tax revenues are deposited in the cannabis regulation fund. After the end of the fiscal year, the remaining unexpended and obligated balance is transferred to the general fund. Of that amount, 30% goes to substance misuse.
But so in FY 26, how does the regulation fund get funded? Just from general fund, just regular appropriations? They don't get a set amount.
So it may be helpful for that question to pivot to an Excel tab that I prepared for y'all and share my screen. That'll show kind of how that mechanism works. Roughly speaking, the FY 26 expenses are being paid for from the FY 25 transfer, but I'll show that in a spreadsheet and be more clear.
And I'm sorry, I have to go in 5 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
and I apologize. I just want to be clear, and it doesn't matter to me, 24 and 25. FY 26,
Mm-hmm.
it is true that 100% of cannabis excise tax revenues will go in the general fund,
Mm-hmm.
and then we are obligated to supply 30% of that back out.
Exactly.
So 70% of cannabis excise tax is unexpended in 26 and beyond.
It is part of, it's not unexpended, so it's part of the available general fund forecast that you all use as a starting place to build your budget.
But also some of it has to go to the fund of cannabis control board.
And so that's being paid for with the 25 transfer.
And there always be it for this year. Okay. And now a transfer like that, or just between those 2 years? Or you're going to show us that on your spreadsheet?
Part of it will be in the spreadsheet. I think it is an open question for when you're building the FY 27 budget, how you will fund the control board. And yeah, that's a bit of an open question.
You could either do it through just like we fund every other part of state government, or you could keep them tied to the tax.
Yes, and there is a different, right, so if I'm gonna go into my spreadsheet.
Senator Weston had a question.
Yes.
On the 30%,
Mhm.
and I know we discussed this, and I can't remember whether we didn't do it or, that the 30%, when it reached a certain number, got capped. When is that?
10 million.
Is
10 million,
yes,
10 million?
yes, and we're not, I'm gonna show you on the spreadsheet, the revenues are not gonna hit that amount. Okay, so on this tab,
Can you make it 1 time bigger?
I can.
Yeah.
Does that work for everyone?
That's good.
Great. And so showing columns, so this is how the construct was built in the GovRec and what you all got from the House. I will highlight this. So what they're doing is they're starting with a net operating amount that is annualized. So they were looking at where excise tax revenue and control board expenses were in fiscal year 25 and multiplied that by 2 to get an annual amount. And so this number is net of this excise tax revenue, net of what the control board needs in fiscal year 25 to pay for their expenses kind of when you add in fees. So there's both excise tax revenue in the regulation fund and fees. And so those are your sources. What's being used for the board is your use. And so you're left with this $12.9 million, almost 13 million.
So can you remind me when we passed this, did we think the fees would meet the annual expenses of the control board?
That was, as I understand it, hard for me to speak to intent, the intent, yes, but right now their fees it's estimated at $2.5 million in fees, and the control board's budget is in the $6 million range. So there's a gap there.
So it's quite a big gap. And is that's not because fees came in lower, it's just that the regulation costs are higher.
The fee structure was set up to make the legal adult use cannabis market accessible to folks who might have been in the illicit market. So if you were to charge a fee amount that was commensurate to pay for the Cannabis Control Board expenses, it may prohibit folks from participating in the market. So I was working on that trade-off.
Right. But we thought that it would take maybe $2.5 million to run the Cannabis Control Board back when we didn't have one, when it was just like a vision.
That was a little bit before my time, yeah.
Senator Norris?
Yes, I was just wondering, Ted, if you give me, for instance, maybe, the substance misuse prevention 30%, what entities tap into that, so to speak?
So I am more of a revenue person. I will look to my budget friends. I know it's before this, the budget this year creates a substance misuse prevention special fund, but before it used to go into a B section of the budget, B 313, I think.
Yeah.
The health
all went to
department,
the health department, and it all went to.
There's the substance use, in the web report, P13 is the substance use prevention section. But then they granted out to all sorts of different programs.
Yeah,
It's a grant program is what it is?
it depends. Could be a grant program, it could be funding.
And the board, there's
Yeah.
a particular board that makes a recommendation on where to appropriate that money.
Right.
And is that those,
Yeah, I mean, it could go into DOC programs for MOUD, MAT. It can go a number of places.
are those called just the prevention funds?
Yeah.
People say
Yes.
the prevention
Yeah.
funds, they're meaning that 2.5 million or the 3.8. Who proposed by whom?
So this, to answer a few questions, the universe of prevention funds that's in that B section is much larger than the revenue that is coming from cannabis.
Okay.
And this $2.5 million is the transfer amount that's in the budget as it came over from the House, and this was it's the same numbers that were in the GovRec. And so yes, this 2.5 is saying they're forecasting that in fiscal year 26, the transfer of FY25 revenue will be about $8.4 million. And of that $8.4 million, when you take 30% of it, it's 2.5
For 26.
for 26.
So in the budget sheets now, is there a 5.4 number? 5.4 million? No, for cannabis. And I just wondered if that 5.4 is what theirs is 8.4. Because that's one of the reasons we had to come in to do this talk, because we're like, is that 5.4 the right number? No, is that right? Do you remember that? Isn't there a 5 point?
I also say 5 points.
There's a $5.9 million transfer to the general fund. Yeah.
Okay.
And so yes, this is to one of the earlier questions, right? So you have, starting from the net operating amount of almost 13 million, this one-time transfer out is a $500,000 appropriation to the Cannabis Business Development Fund. It was in the miscellaneous cannabis bill last year. And then this next, so you have a net available, and then this next row.
So why is it two net? So the annualized net is net of operating costs?
It's net of that $500,000 appropriation to the Business Development Fund.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is differentiating things that are used to fund the control board versus other uses.
Right. Okay.
So I'm remembering when we were talking with the control board, or even in statute, I'm trying to remember what it said, that the board would use everything it needs from revenue, from taxation, and use everything it needs for all the work it does. And after that, then funds would be available for general fund and for the substance misuse prevention fund. So the question I have is, how is that determined? How is it determined how much the Cannabis Control Board needs? How does that happen? Is that Are
We do it
we,
in here.
They bring the budget to us.
yeah, I know, but every year it's going up quite high, and I don't remember, I'm trying to remember what
Well, like, for
the
example.
$5 million increase in 1 year, what's going on that causes that need, that's all, just asking.
Yeah, I don't think it's a 5 million increase in 1 year, but I think there has been an increase, like they wanted the new lab
Yeah, they got the new lab,
position, so there,
and they had enforcement or
Does-
inspection
Does this
people,
because when they started, we used general fund to start with.
right?
And that, as that general fund went away, it got replaced with this.
Right.
So I don't know where those lines crossed.
and this isn't like ups and downs, this isn't the change, these are the
No,
totals.
this is it.
But I don't understand column B versus column C.
So, we're getting there,
Okay.
yes. Absolutely. And so one final piece is, instead of after your net available of 12.4,
Yeah,
they're retaining $4 million to pay for the control board in fiscal year 26.
right,
Because there's no mechanism, general fund, excise tax revenues going to the general fund, so switching to this new system, they're retaining $4 million, which is the control board's expenses of roughly 6, net of approximately $2.5 million in fees.
okay,
And so you have this $4 million that they're retaining out of the transfer to pay for the control board. And so that leaves this amount from the FY25 excise revenues that are transferred in fiscal year 26. The net available is this $8.4 million that's split 70-30. So it's a bit of a convoluted mechanism to get to this place, but it deals with the transfer in fiscal year 25 and pays for the control board's expenses to facilitate this transition to a different allocation of excise tax revenues.
okay.
Column C, upon crunching the numbers again, right, it takes a little time for excise tax revenue to get from the general fund to the regulation funds. So when the budget was being constructed, it may have looked like there would be less available as part of this allocation. Looking where we are with a few more months of experience, there might be more additional revenue that is available for allocation. After doing this kind of taking the revenue expenses for fiscal year 25 and then retaining fiscal year 26, instead of $8.4 million, you might have 12.8. And so what that means is roughly so that's $4.3 million of additional revenue, and split 70-30 is $3 million of additional general fund, $1.3 million of additional substance misuse.
And then when did these new numbers come out? Was that yesterday, or was this known by the House before was this after they passed their bill?
So this, I wouldn't say this is hot off the presses. It was, seeing the numbers that were in the budget, I felt like there might be additional room there, but wanted to have enough experience to make sure that was actually true.
Okay, so instead of 5.9, it could be 8.9. That's the kind of punchline here.
Exactly, for general fund. And
Yes, I mean,
I would think, and the additional sort of thing to keep in mind, right, is that there is an additional $1.3 million for substance misuse. To the
Right.
extent there are things in the general fund construct that qualify as substance misuse, they can be shifted
Right.
to this fund,
right.
but they have to be allowable.
So, and I asked Amy for this, it would be helpful to have all the kind of substance use asks, budgets in one table, because they're kind of, when they see them spread throughout the chart or the sheet, and then I get confused between all of them. It's not a health and welfare between all the different recovery programs.
Who's on the board? Because there's a board that makes that recommendation.
Are you thinking the opioid settlement fund?
Yeah, well,
That's different.
Opioid settlement fund is
That has a
different.
board.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
different.
that has an advisory
Yep.
committee.
So how is this 3.8 million decided? Is that just the health department? Not just, but the health department does it?
Yep,
Yeah,
Yeah, so we can find out.
and we could direct it, I mean, we can say, use it for, children's programs
Yep.
versus other, recovery type programs, can do whatever.
Okay.
Is there any room to use that money in programs we budgeted for in other areas in the healthcare world?
Yeah, I mean,
You know what I'm saying?
It's all fungible.
yeah, could go to medical transport. They do transport people for, substance abuse, services.
They have for substance use
Okay.
treatment for the DAs. and the
And-
DAs.
Purchase and use tax next year.
So when do we have to decide on the construct for this difference of 20? I guess it's not till 27, decide whether any of the tax goes to the control board first? Like where they take their costs off the top and then we have a number, or should it be all go, starting next year or starting FY 26, it'll all go to the general fund? And then they'll just get an appropriation, just like agency of BAG or anybody.
Yeah.
Right, that's the way, there's nothing we have to do to make that happen, that's just the way it's gonna be. Okay. So, that's helpful news, because there's 3 million, 4 million, 3. Yeah. Good, so Ted just brought us $3 million.
Thank you.
Come back more often.
That might be all I have for now.
I can use that.
Can I reiterate what I said earlier? Sometimes you file a pile of money and then you immediately fall in a hole, so don't.
And I thought you were also gonna say about special funds and why you wouldn't want to have it go to the control board. We would want it to go to the general fund and then we appropriate out of the general fund. for the
Yes.
Control board.
I mean, it is a policy choice
Yeah.
to direct it to the control board versus put it in the general fund, sort of what the appropriations conversation is based on what sort of path you decide to take in terms of dedicating the revenue versus not.
And I've heard a lot of people, because I think a lot of people know about this change. So they say, oh, this percentage that used to, go to the control board first is now, unlike the senator just said earlier, that it's unencumbered almost. And so I think I've gotten like 4 different proposals, like take that portion of the excise tax and give it to special fund X, Y, or Z, and then.
But I think you have to pay for the control board first.
Right, but we don't have to pay for medical cannabis fees, we don't want to.
No. I think like in the grand scheme of the universe, this money not going directly to the control board doesn't make it available. You still have the expenditures associated with the control board, so
Right.
it's sort of a net zero situation. Having the money go directly to the general fund versus going to the control board and then to the general fund.
So what would those expenditures be, just as a for instance?
I think the staff that run the board.
I mean, the $6 million.
Staffing, personnel, I mean?
The lab, their office space.
Field
Getting to the lab.
Field inspection, applications, licensure.
Yeah, whatever their regulatory functions are.
But that 5.9, for example, in the gov rec, or in the proposed 8.9, there's no conditional usage of that.
No,
That's always, since we've had it, which hasn't been very long, it's just been part of the general fund and expended like all other general funds. Okay.
Returning also one final point to my, putting back on my revenue hat, is that broadly speaking, the trajectory of new cannabis markets is that, there's an initial flurry of activity, people are really excited. And then afterwards, a lot of folks rush into the market and there tends to be a bit of a dip in the second year. So one thing to think about as you're getting a lot of requests on tying this revenue to specific uses is that the revenue might not always be there, particularly in a new market. So.
One thing that I look at is liquor sales have dipped as the cannabis sales have gone, and it would be interesting to see what the liquor sales are compared to the cannabis sales in this, because there seems to be some playoff against the two.
Yeah, it does.
I think in a world where creating a new market doesn't change the amount of funds that individuals have to spend on things, right? So that there's a trade-off. And I think having this market be so new, right? We don't have a mature market yet, so we don't know what steady state is, and we don't know the sort of larger economic impacts are on the market in terms of what happens when we're in good times and what happens when we're in bad times. And right, you see that in things like the liquor fund, right? People behave differently depending on how things are going.
Well, this has been the new thing, and it was coming up, and liquor sales have gone down, and the taxes on liquor are higher.
And sports betting added into that mix. And as the taxes are a percentage, if there is more market saturation, that's gonna have a pressure down on prices, which lowers the revenues. So, okay, any other questions? Mr. Barnes? Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Thanks for the $3 million.
Of course, I wish I could say anytime.
Yeah. Just the proposal. Well, most people want $3 million. Ted gave it.
I'm gonna book the 3 million.
Meaning you're gonna put
I'm gonna put them in the sheet.
You
Yeah.
can use it for after.
Doesn't mean I'm not gonna change other numbers.
Walk cautiously.
Yeah. Okay.
So now I'm in 57 million.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say, we
$3
could subtract it from the hole we're in already.
Slightly.
Have less of a hole.
So yeah, I don't think we're prepared to do any other work today unless people have questions that they want to air at this moment. I have more work to do, working with JFO and with Senator Lyons on stuff on health and welfare, but I hope to get a list of those prevention funds and all the recovery funds kind of as a group, maybe even explanation for some of them. Because even when I talk to people, there seems to be confusion about the different programs.
There was one note on his spreadsheet at the bottom that showed that a lot of those prevention funds go to after school and the summer food program.
Well, they get the 6% sales
Yeah.
tax, so they don't
Yeah.
have to even
They
compete
don't
for
get
the
the excess.
prevention. Right.
Exactly. But remember also that the tobacco settlement funds are declining, so anything we can get that will help fill the gaps in for prevention will be really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, we're gonna